What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. Hope everyone's having an amazing weekend. I'm back to call attention to a little low-budget movie that got released online yesterday, and this is a movie that is unlikely to have a massive cultural impact. However, this is a movie that I think will have massive appeal to a very niche audience. And the movie I'm talking about is The Headhunter from director Jordan Downey. So the movie tells the story of a monster hunter who collects the heads of the most horrible creatures imaginable, but his job will not be complete until he collects the head of the creature who killed his daughter. Miraculously, the movie's only 1 hour and 11 minutes long, has almost no dialogue, and due to its extremely limited budget for special effects, more often than not, it has to rely upon very clever sleight of hand and trickery in order to make this fantasy world convincing. But the main reason that I want to give this movie some extra special, tender love and attention is that as someone who spent their entire childhood and young adult life playing Dungeons and Dragons, anytime we're presented with a good fantasy film, especially a dark fantasy film, that is cause for celebration. I've still got all my D&D books down there, and I've got my dice around here as well, so anytime someone wants to make a character, I'm still ready to go. But as a kid living through the early 80s, it was a very easy time to fall in love with the fantasy genre. This was the time of movies like Excalibur, Conan the Barbarian, The Dark Crystal, Clash of the Titans, The Last Unicorn, Fire and Ice, Dragon Slayer, The Neverending Story, Beastmaster, Krull, The Sword and the Sorcerer. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that not all these films were created equal, but I was a kid when they all came out, so I didn't care. I devoured them all repeatedly. And I haven't even mentioned the long list of fantasy films like Deathstalker 2 that are basically thinly disguised softcore porn, but definitely required viewings for fans of fantasy. My point is that in cinema, it was a time of wizards and warriors, and when the boom ended, it ended hard. But luckily by that point, I was old enough to start reading some of the brilliant fantasy novels out there, a passion that I have maintained to the present day, where at least on the page, we're enjoying a bit of a golden age of fantasy fiction, where writers like Steven Erikson and R. Scott Bakker, and of course George R. R. Martin, are absolutely thriving. So in the 21st century, fantasy fans have enjoyed two amazing pop culture phenomenons. In the early 2000s, we had the Lord of the Rings trilogy, movies that proved that fantasy could do huge box office and take home Academy Awards. I saw The Return of the King 6 times in the theater and would cry like a baby each time the Riders of Rohan arrived to save the day at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Sadly, I thought Peter Jackson's 3 Hobbit films pretty much sucked, but luckily, since 2011, we've been able to enjoy the global dominance of the Game of Thrones phenomenon, a show that proves that even casual fans of the genre can absolutely be swept away by fantasy under the right circumstances. But given the popularity of The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, I'm absolutely amazed that we have not seen a second fantasy renaissance like the one we experienced in the early 1980s. And I'm not overlooking the popularity of the stories by J.K. Rowling, but when I discuss fantasy, I'm talking about fictional settings with maps of places that have never existed, alongside corresponding giant tomes of history that have never happened. So when I first caught the trailer for The Headhunter, I was immediately intrigued, but when I started watching the film last night, it took only about 5 minutes before I started doing cartwheels. Already, I'm a little worried that I'm overselling this movie, but there is so much about this film that I absolutely loved. The tone is utterly grim, completely savage. The environment is cold and relentless, but eerily beautiful, almost like Robert E. Howard's descriptions of Samaria, the land that produced a young lad named Conan. The central character of this movie, he doesn't even have a name. On IMDb, he's just listed as Father, and most of his dialogue consists of grunts and growls and roars and screams as he goes about his daily chores. Actor Christopher Rygh, R-Y-G-H, I have no idea how to pronounce his last name. I believe he's from Oslo, so your guess is as good as mine. But physically, he's absolutely perfect. He's completely, totally jacked, but not like he spent a lot of time in the gym. He has this like freakish functional strength, almost like he's a blacksmith with like knotted muscles all over his forearms. And his character leads a pretty routine existence. Periodically, he'll hear a horn blow in the distance, whereupon he knows it's time to go to work. An archer at a nearby castle fires notes out to a tree, and these notes have drawings of the latest monstrosity that's kind of prowling the land. And this guy grabs the note almost like a bounty hunter, and he rides off to battle. Now, we typically see him coming home after the fact with his body completely torn to shreds, sometimes like half his face is missing, but he usually has the monster's head in a sack, which promptly gets mounted on the wall alongside all the other trophies. And this land is teeming with every kind of creature imaginable, even dragons, which are wonderfully teased with audio and shadow, but are never actually seen due to the financial constraints of the film. On a few occasions, the film splurges a little bit of cash on a special effects shot, like there's this beautiful moment where a troll the size of a small mountain is strolling along in the distance, but these shots are very rare. But what keeps this guy going is this magic elixir which he uses on his wounds. He has this jar of black glop, which whenever he applies it, he completely, utterly roars in pain, but it allows him to survive the most horrific injuries imaginable and get back to work as early as possible. Because this guy's whole life is devoted to killing. His home is covered in pieces of armor and weapons, and when he's fully geared up, he looks totally badass. The shots of him with all of his gear on made me want to dust off one of my old characters in Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and spend a few hours slaughtering my enemies. What's great though is how lived in and authentic this world feels, almost like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at times, especially in the latter part of the film where the fantasy ingredients nearly slip away entirely into the world of horror. Now, what I'm going to discuss next is definitely a full-blown spoiler, so if that's a concern for you, jump ship now. But my only real knock against this movie is the main villain, who doesn't manage to get cool until the very end of the film. What happens is that after successfully avenging his daughter, Father leaves the head of the beast on the floor of his home, and due to an accident with the wind, the jar of magic black goo gets spilled on the beast's head. This basically makes the creature immortal, allowing itself to rebuild its body from whenever materials are available, including the skeleton of the man's daughter. But frequently, the creature is little more than a head with a wiggling spine, and as the two of them battle, the scenes get a little unintentionally humorous, and it was during these scenes where I really started to notice the limited budget of the film. But I can't really complain because the movie bounces back with this wonderfully sadistic, fucked up ending that put a huge, big, evil smile on my face, and that's when I knew I needed to try my own way to call attention to this movie. This film is not for everybody, but it's only an hour and 11 minutes, so what do you have to lose? What I will say is that the filmmaking team of director Jordan Downey and co-writer Kevin Stewart are officially on my radar. I should also mention that Kevin Stewart was the film's director of photography as well, and I'd love to see these two guys continue to collaborate. They managed that rare feat of giving us champagne for the price of beer, and if they ever get their hands on some real cash, they will make a movie that will absolutely blow all of our minds. I can think of no team alive today that's better suited to dust off Robert E. Howard's classic short stories and make Conan live again. At any rate, I think I've ranted and raved enough at this point. As you can tell, I like fantasy quite a bit. I like fantasy video games, I like fantasy comics, I like fantasy novels, and I particularly like fantasy movies, but I so rarely get to enjoy fantasy movies that it almost makes me cry when a good one comes along. So if you've ever liked the genre in any way, shape, or form, definitely give this movie a look. And if we don't support these movies, no fantasy movies will get made at all. But if you want to talk to me about any form of fantasy, the best place to reach me is on Twitter at Colbrex. There's a link in the description below. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. We're knocking at the door of Game of Thrones right around the corner. I'll definitely be back to review the final season. But can't thank you enough for watching my video. I really appreciate the support. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.